All right, hello everybody, welcome. This webinar is one of a series of webinars that Scrum Alliance is hosting about Agile leadership. We are holding these monthly and you are able to obtain one Category F SEU from this webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be distributed to all who registered later this week along with a PDF of the slide deck. After the presentation, you may ask questions to our presenters by entering them into the chat box on the left-hand side. We will try to answer as many questions as possible, but if we miss any questions, we will work to get them out in the following weeks to this audience. We do understand that individuals experience technical difficulties at times, and restarting the webinar will usually solve these problems. If you are unable to do so, we will send out a recording so you won't miss this information. I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers today. David Horowitz is co-founder of Retrium, is co-founder and CEO of Retrium Inc. Retrium is the world's first and only enterprise-ready platform for Agile retrospectives. Prior to co-founding Retrium, David spent nearly a decade between the World Bank and International Finance Corporation as a software developer turned Agile coach. While there, he experienced firsthand the importance and difficulty of effective retrospectives at scale. In addition to bachelor's degrees in computer science and economics from the University of Maryland, as well as a master's degree in technology management from the University of Pennsylvania and the Wharton School of Business, David successfully founded and exited a movie search engine business in 2013. He is married to his college sweetheart and is the father of 3 little ones. Next, Nikki Kuhari is a serial entrepreneur, author, and lifelong learner with a passion for helping people work better together. With over 9 years of experience in software startups at various stages, she is currently the COO at Retrium and a certified executive and leadership coach at BrightSpark Coaching. Her background is in industrial organizational psychology with expertise in leadership development, organizational change, emotions in the workplace, mental models, and teamwork. So thank you guys so much for being here, David and Nikki. Go ahead and take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Jack, for inviting us to be here today, and really excited about the webinar and the opportunity. Nikki and I, we live and breathe retrospectives 24/7, and it's quite literally. Sometimes at 3 in the morning I wake up thinking about retrospectives, for better or worse. And this talk is really the culmination of a lot of hard thinking we've done over the past year or so around what's working and what's not working in our industry around retrospectives. And what I would like to do is to kind of take a step back and go back to the essence of what agility truly is. What you see on your screen right now, of course, is a beautiful picture of a faraway place, somewhere in the ocean with some nice sand, relaxing breeze perhaps. I want all of you to take a moment to take a deep breath and take yourself out of your stressful work environment, a step out of your stressful personal lives, and place yourself in a relaxing zone on that island. And actually take a deep breath with me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read to you something that you've heard 1,000 times, the Agile Manifesto. And I'm starting with the Agile Manifesto because a lot of times when I hear it these days, it just kind of goes in one ear and out the other, and I forget about the core value and the essence of what the Agile Manifesto is trying to get across to us. So I'm going to read it, and as I'm reading it, I want you to really focus in on what the essence of what it's getting at is as you're sitting and relaxing on that desert island. It says, "We are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. Through this work, we have come to value individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following a plan. That is, while there's value in the items on the right, we value the items on the left more." Now, keeping the essence of what that statement is telling you in mind, I want you to think about the following question. If you could only bring one Agile technique with you to the desert island that you are mentally on right now, which one would it be? The daily stand-up, sprint planning and reviews, prioritize backlogs, retrospectives, cross-functional teams, or other? I'm going to give you about 45 seconds here to go ahead and answer a poll so we can get a sense of what the audience thinks. about 15 more seconds here. Looks like we have a good number of responses. So I'm going to go ahead and show the results. So it looks like most people, 28%, the most popular option was the retrospective. And of course, that's heartwarming for me as someone who's passionate around retrospectives. And if you ask me which technique I would bring to a desert island, of course, it would be the retrospective. But the reason is perhaps more interesting. The reason is that if you think about what Agile is, it's just in 2 words. I could describe it pretty easily. Agile is continuous improvement. And we know that to be true from a product perspective, certainly. Every 2 weeks or however long your sprints are, we're delivering some product increment that provides value as early and as often to our stakeholders, to our customers. But it's also true from a process perspective. This is something that we forget about sometimes. That is to say that the way that we're developing software should also be continuously improving over time. And if the way that you're developing software is the same yesterday or 6 months ago, for that matter, as it is today, there's an easy question you can ask yourself, which is, are we really Agile in the first place? In fact, one statement that I like to make is this one, that retrospectives are the catalyst of true agility. In other words, if you're not retrospecting, are you Agile in the first place? If Agile is just continuous improvement and the retrospective is the driver of that continuous improvement, can you be Agile without effectively retrospecting? Now, I put retrospective with an asterisk here because, unfortunately for most of us, our retrospectives are not as effective as we would like them to be. In fact, when you look at what the Agile Manifesto is saying about retrospectives, it says one of the principles is at regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective, then tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly. This is the retrospective in a nutshell. The trouble is that for many of us, only the first half of that statement is actually true. At regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective, full stop. That's the retrospective. That is the meeting in and of itself. It's the second half, then tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly, that many of us struggle to do effectively. And if we're not following through on the retrospectives, are we retrospecting in the first place? Are we actually improving? Probably not. At Retrium, we recently sent out a survey, which we are calling the Annual Retrospective Report. It is the first systematic attempt at understanding the challenges, the opportunities, and the approaches that in the industry we're using for our retrospectives. One of the questions we asked in that survey was, what are the biggest challenges you face in running successful retrospectives? And the number one response, most popular response we got, was that topics discussed in the team cannot be solved by the team. Think about that for a moment. 50%, fully half of all teams running retrospectives are discussing things they can't solve. If that is the problem that your team is facing, it's no wonder that we struggle with our retrospectives. Retrospectives are complaining opportunities for too many of us, not opportunities to actually learn. In fact, at Retrium, we talk about something called the vicious cycle of retrospective disillusionment. That's a mouthful, but it's actually quite a simple topic to understand. The idea is this, that if you're retrospective and you come up with 1 or 2 action items that you want to work on collectively as a team, and then maybe you go home for the weekend, you come back Monday morning, and it's time for your next sprint. And then you go through the next 2 weeks, and you have a lot of pressure from management. You have a lot of pressure from stakeholders, from your product owner, from the organizational culture that you are a part of in building your product. And at the end of the next sprint, you retrospect again to figure out how can we improve. And you look back on the previous retrospective action items, and you ask yourself, did we actually fix anything? Did we actually improve? And if the answer is no, then likely what will happen is that the people who are around the table for this next retrospective will be disengaged in the retro. And that's actually a logical response. Because if nothing is changing, why would I be engaged in the meeting? If the entire purpose of the retrospective is change and we're not achieving that, it's no wonder people are disengaged in our retrospectives. Unfortunately, this is a vicious cycle. If you're not engaged in your retro, you're not going to be coming up with action items that are appropriate, action items that are impactful. And if you're not coming up with action items that are impactful, then we're not going to follow through on them. And again, if we're not following through on them, why would we be engaged in the retro? So on and so forth. It's almost a catch-22. How do you break this cycle of retrospective disillusionment? How can you get out of this vicious cycle and change from a retrospective being a complaining opportunity to an opportunity to actually learn? That's going to be the focus of this talk. And I started with the essence of agility because I want to make sure as we're going through the talk, all of you are focusing in on why we're talking about this issue instead of all of the other important issues in Agile. Because in a nutshell, if you can't break this vicious cycle, we are not Agile as an industry. And that's a problem we all have to own up to. The way this is going to work is I'm going to hand this off to Nikki, who's going to talk about some theoretical underpinnings to a solution to this problem around engagement and voice and many other things. And then she's going to turn it back to me at the end of the webinar to go over 5 actionable and practical tips you can take home today, tomorrow, in this sprint to improve your retrospectives and take them from a cycle of vicious disillusionment to a cycle of actionable learning. Go ahead, Nikki.
Great. So we are here today to help you break the cycle of retrospective disillusionment, as David already mentioned, or even prevent it from happening altogether. And there is a virtuous cycle that can be created from retrospectives to employee voice, employee engagement, to team and organizational performance in the Agile context. And then, of course, back to the retrospective to learn, share information, check in, and adjust to start the process all over again. And employee engagement is something most of you have probably heard about since it's been a trending topic for some years now. But employee voice, an essential driver of engagement at work, is something very few people have discussed. So let's take a step back, since I'm the theoretical portion of today's talk, and talk about why Agile to begin with. So let's think broadly for a moment about why a company would want to embrace an Agile perspective. Likely it was to stay competitive in your market, adapt to change quickly, work closer with customers, create innovative solutions, and communicate and collaborate more effectively. Regardless as to whether you work at a large established company or a new startup, a decision was made at some point to take an Agile approach. And of course, making that decision in some ways is the easy part. The cultural shift of getting Agile to be central to the hearts and minds of the people within your organization, that part is actually much harder. Many organizations see small changes happen and happen relatively quickly, and so they assume that a cultural change has happened. So it's good enough, we're done, right? And of course, that cultural change happening is typically not the case, and people easily fall back into old habits or stop doing the things that helped create those small changes to begin with. So it's important to create sustainable agility by changing people's mindsets and not just their behaviors. So let's take a look at some research here. Many of you may have seen this before. This is the version 1 State of Agile survey. And this shows reasons why people go Agile to begin with. And it's to accelerate product delivery, manage changing priorities, increase productivity, and a host of other reasons that are listed here on the slide. And within all of those reasons is really an assumption that Agile helps a company continuously improve and be competitive in their market. And in order to execute and actually make these things happen over the long term, the people within your organization have to buy in and believe that their efforts can help contribute to the changes or continuous improvement that an organization wants to see. So when employees don't feel empowered, they start using those old routines, or they feel angry or frustrated, or they simply do nothing since they don't believe their efforts are worth the cost. And in fact, we see that the elements associated with people's buy-in come up in the challenges of adopting and scaling Agile in the same version 1 survey. Many of these issues here are culture, people, and learning related. And if the environment doesn't support whatever change you're trying to create or scaling effort you're trying to do, whether it's the system itself or the company's management, people are not going to be set up for success. And they'll eventually feel disempowered and frustrated if they don't perceive that their work or ideas are going to be moving the company in a good direction. So overcoming many of these challenges requires listening to people on the front lines and leveraging the best ideas so the company can truly inspect and adapt. And this will not only help the company move forward, but it also helps employees feel like their perspective actually has an impact on the success of the organization. So how can we tell if employees' needs are being met? They're enthusiastic about their work. They actually understand their role in the change or the scaling effort. and they feel able to help the company go to the next level. Much of this is going to be reflected in something that organizations are already tracking, which is called, of course, employee engagement. And why have companies been measuring and paying attention to engagement? Certainly because it's a reflection of how things are going for employees, but also because low engagement is incredibly expensive, as you see in this quote here. It costs U.S. companies at least $483 billion a year, that's $1 billion a year in lost productivity when employees are disengaged. So when people don't know what's expected of them, they don't think others are committed, they don't believe sharing information makes a difference, or they don't understand an internal initiative, you can expect to see low engagement scores. And times of change or scaling can be difficult for people to adjust to without an appropriate outlet to discuss the change and consider ways to make it better. So let's take a quick look at some types of engagement and how the results of high engagement might map onto the reasons to go Agile to begin with. There's some interesting parallels here. So highly engaged employees, that's 33% according to Gallup. They're not only satisfied, but they're also passionate about their work. And they're committed, and they put in what we call discretionary effort into their job, which is actually going above and beyond what's typically part of their role in the company. And employees that are not engaged, that's actually 51%, the majority here, they aren't having their needs met in some way. They might put the time in, but they're rarely going to be enthusiastic or passionate about things that are going on. They're really missing a reason to jump in with both feet at the company. They either may not understand what's expected of them, which is common with organizational transformations or fast-paced environments like software companies, or maybe they aren't getting a chance to reflect on their good work, which is actually common in organizations, of course, that don't take the time to retrospect or don't take the time to do it very well. And they may also not believe that their opinions count because they don't have an outlet to speak up and suggest a different solution. Again, something that's going to be a problem without effective retrospectives in a company. And if you take a look at the last group here, this is, of course, the most concerning, and that's actively disengaged employees. And 16% of people, they're not only unhappy in their job, but they're actually resentful, and they can act out in ways that drive customers away from the company or actually undermine the things that their engaged colleagues are doing in the workforce. So let's take a moment to reflect on engagement and the colleagues that you might have worked with before. So you've probably experienced people who fit into each one of these categories. Picture for a second an actively disengaged employee you've worked with, or maybe imagine what that could be like if you happen to be very lucky and have worked in very highly engaged environments before. How do you think it would affect you if you were working with another employee that was highly disengaged and doing some of these things to act out? How would it affect your attitude at work and, of course, your performance as well? Take a couple of seconds to think about that, jot it down or put it into the chat, and we can kind of take a look and see what information is showing up there. And then now consider for a second being on a team that looks a little bit more like this, which at least based on the picture, looks like a group of highly engaged people. What would it look like, or what was your experience working with a group of people that were highly engaged? What differences would you see in yourself working with this team of highly engaged people? And what sort of organizational level outcomes might you expect to be different if people are actively engaged and excited and passionate about their work versus disengaged? I'm going to give you a couple seconds to think about that as well, and perhaps jot down some ideas into the chat as to your thoughts in this area. So if you said that you felt there are some elements of yourself that might be different based upon the people you're working with, you'd actually be well in line with the research in this area. There's a ton of research out there on something called emotional contagion, and sort of a related topic called mirror neurons, which are a type of neuron in the brain. And the research in this area is fascinating if you ever get a chance to really dig into it. It suggests that both mood and engagement can be contagious and often unconsciously. So we're not even noticing that we're influenced in a positive or negative way based on the engagement of the people that we're working closely with. So working with people who are more engaged can help a group of people generate new ideas, learn, make connections in creative ways. And so you might expect then that engagement has a very strong influence on team and organizational performance. And so we're going to kind of roll that back and take a look at the relationship of the benefits of engagement and how that's related to the version 1 survey that we looked at in one of my first slides. Let's take a look here at what Gallup says are some of the benefits of engagement. And just as an aside here as well, if you aren't measuring engagement within your organization, you might want to consider tracking it. And it's not necessarily something where it's just an HR initiative or something they should be doing. It's really something we should all be caring about because it's creating business results and teamwork. That's something that we all should really be caring about as an organization. And, if you're just tapping into employee engagement once a year, it should be something where you should be checking in on it more often and making sure they're actually addressing people's concerns. And that's vital to moving the needle towards the outcomes that we really want to see in a company. So you'll notice here, you've gotten a chance to kind of take a look at this slide. You'll notice the benefits of engagement according to Gallup's State of the Workforce. Looks very similar to the same benefits mentioned for adopting Agile in the version 1 survey. That's elements of productivity, quality, and profitability. So that said, a company that embraces an Agile culture should be paying close attention to not just measuring employee engagement, but putting mechanisms in place that have been shown to help enhance engagement. So let me say that again. If you are an Agile culture within your organization, it's not just good enough to measure engagement. It's actually really, really important if you want to see the results of going Agile to begin with, to put mechanisms in place that have been shown to help enhance engagement. And of course, the question then is, well, what are those mechanisms? And what's interesting is in the research in this area, a lot less work has been done to figure out what the predictors of engagement are versus the outcomes. We have very, very good data on the outcomes at this point. So companies have tried to kind of put the cart before the horse a little bit and say, okay, well, let's try, extra perks like free lunch, or, maybe we'll put in some ping pong tables. And those are some quick fixes that companies have moved forward with. And these can be interpreted as hollow solutions sometimes by employees if there are larger problems that actually need to be addressed. So let's talk about one of the most important predictors of employee engagement and one of the antecedents. And it's probably something that you've never heard of before, never made this connection before. So it's called employee voice. And it's one of the hidden drivers of employee engagement. And this quote is from an article by David McLeod and Nita Clark, and they suggest employee voice is a key enabler to engagement, and yet not well understood or frequently practiced within organizations. So if you haven't heard about it, you're probably in the majority of people. And the article is really interesting because it goes on to say that voice is a critical part of business success and one of the best ways to create value within a company. Which, of course, if it's really going to give us those results, it's something we should all be paying close attention to and figuring out what is it and how do we get more of that. So what is voice? Employee voice is defined in the organizational psychology literature as the discretionary communication of suggestions, ideas, concerns, problems, learnings, or opinions about the work or the workplace with the intent to improve an organization or a team. And this voice could be communicated to peers, to other teams, or up the organizational ladder. But the purpose is to help bring about some sort of change that's beneficial and moves the organization beyond the status quo, which, of course, you've been paying attention, sounds a lot like continuous improvement. There's some parallels with the research in this area and the ideas behind Agile. A recent article published by IBM called Amplifying Employee Voice, How Organizations Can Better Connect to the Pulse of the Workforce, suggests that technology is now more effective than ever at capturing, analyzing, and responding to employee ideas, their concerns, and their comments, yet there really is more that we need to do. And they're suggesting that the next thing that we should be doing, focusing on employee voice and engagement, is moving past yearly surveys or small focus groups that only happen maybe in HR. And really, we need to be focusing on more frequent and web-based opportunities for collaboration, feedback, and learning that can be shared not only within a team, but outside of the team and within the organization as well. So at this point, you might be thinking, okay, well, my employees in my company, we're already empowered to speak up. After all, anybody can message or call or email anybody else. We have all of these different tools and mechanisms and outlets where it's easier to connect with people than ever before, right? So everyone should be speaking up. However, you might be surprised that the research actually finds the opposite, that most employees default to staying quiet because they don't feel comfortable speaking up, or they don't know how to do it. They have all of these mechanisms, but they don't know which one is best, and so they kind of get paralyzed by the process. So how can we encourage people to share their voice and help their company continuously improve? And that research has been done by Morrison, and what they found is that there are many ways that we can tip the scales towards voice and away from silence within organizations. And some of these influencers are going to be personality characteristics or differences that aren't likely to change. So things like extroversion and assertiveness, we're not likely to go in and change that substantially within individuals. But other things that they found are beliefs about the organization or the leadership, things like their support or psychological safety, which has been an interesting topic that's come up a lot with some of the Agilists that I've spoken to, or openness to feedback or a transformational leadership style. And these are all characteristics that could be cultivated with a focus on changing the culture or through training or leadership coaching. And if you're looking at the diagram here, the last area is really of particular interest to our discussion. These are the contextual factors, and they include a formal outlet or a mechanism to speak up. So these are things that are going to go beyond some sort of open door policy to actually create a specific time, specific place, and a specific process for sharing and receiving feedback and learnings. So you're probably thinking, wow, that sounds really familiar to me. And you can think of an effective retrospective as the embodiment of employee voice within an Agile organization. And retrospectives are actually among some of the best outlets for employee voice because they're meant to be frequent, they're meant to cover a short period of time, and they include a lot of contextual information that's often going to get lost in some type of yearly engagement survey or some kind of closed-ended Likert-based questions. So effectively offering an opportunity for employees to speak up, such as a retrospective, has been shown to facilitate both learning and engagement. So there's really a good basis in the organizational psychology literature to suggest that retrospectives are one of the most important things that we should be doing if we want to drive engagement and, of course, team and organizational performance in our companies. So to put it in simple terms, employee voice is going to likely enhance employee engagement, and then that's going to show long-term, hopefully, some improvement in quality, productivity, and profitability. So that's really going to get us to the virtuous cycle that we care about. And the role of retrospectives is far clearer when we look through the lens of the organizational psychology literature because it is creating basically a perfect opportunity for effective employee voice which we hope will lead to an uptick in engagement and finally, of course, organizational performance. So the question is, looking at this as, okay, retrospectives are in fact one of the most important things we should be doing in our organization. How can we change that conversation then from something that happens to be a lot of complaining or sort of things that stay only in the retrospective to something that's actionable learning where the entire organization can sometimes benefit from some of the things that are going on? And for those practical tips that are specific to improving your retrospectives, I'll turn it back over to David to kind of dig into some of the ideas there.
Great. So think about how far we've come. We started the webinar talking about retrospectives and as an aspect of Agile, and maybe starting by talking through how retrospectives are possibly the driver of Agile. And we've taken it one step even beyond that to a place where retrospectives are now a driver of employee voice, which is a driver of employee engagement. And you saw the numbers of how critically important engagement is across our industry in terms of actual dollars and cents. Retrospectives are truly the #1 thing that you can do to improve your organization's performance. So I'm going to now go through 5 practical ways to take your retrospectives away from the disengaged blame game that many of us suffer through every single time we run them today, to a point in which you can trust that your retrospective will be giving you an opportunity as a person and an opportunity as a team to have a voice in your organization. So in order of things that are under your control from a team perspective to things that are somewhat out of your control and depend more on your organization's ability to respond to change, as well as your impact at more senior levels of your organization, I'm going to go through 5 different tips to take you from complaining to actionable learning. We're going to start with things that are very much focused inwards on your team, things about how to increase engagement when you're in the retrospective itself. Go from there to how to increase the odds that your team will actually follow through on some small wins, things that your team can actually influence, things that your team can actually change. And then move out from an inward-looking perspective from your team's point of view and move more towards, well, how do we now get a voice not just within our team, but outside of our team as well to the broader organization? Because therein is the secret sauce as it relates to retrospectives as a driver of voice. Imagine a situation in which every single retrospective that you run, you can identify an issue. And if those issues are solvable by your team, you're confident they will be. And if they're not solvable by your team, you're confident that you will have a voice that will be heard by management in your company. Think about that situation and compare it to where you currently are with retrospectives. That's where we're trying to go. So let's start with the first tip, which is creating an environment of equality. Think about your retrospectives today. For many of us, the percentage of people who are actually engaged in the retrospective is actually quite low. And this is unfortunate, but again, it goes back to that vicious cycle that we talked about at the beginning. So there are some pretty standard tips out there for increasing engagement and ultimately increasing equality in your retrospective. Some of them are things like use new facilitation techniques. There are whole books out there written about facilitation techniques. There's practically limitless resources online about all of the different ways to facilitate retrospectives. And absolutely, read through them, understand them, they're valuable resources. But I think it would resonate with many of us if I said that just varying the technique alone likely is not enough to encourage engagement and encourage participation. There are also issues around safety. If you don't feel safe in your retrospectives, then irrespective of the facilitation technique you are using, it's unlikely you will participate. So there is an article written by Dr. Tomas Chamorro-Premuzic, I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly, on Harvard Business Review, where he says, and this is a quote, "Group brainstorming is a waste of time." Now, the first time I read that statement, I was taken aback. Group brainstorming is a waste of time. How is that possibly true? But he talks about 4 reasons why. I'm going to go through each one briefly, and then I'm going to talk about how we can overcome that in order to increase the equality and increase the participation in your retrospectives. So the 4 reasons that the article goes through about why group brainstorming is a waste of time start with, number 1, social loafing. Social loafing is the idea that if there's 15 people in this retrospective, it's actually easier for me not to speak up because other people are talking. I can loaf through this conversation and I'll be okay. I won't be singled out. Reason number 2 group brainstorming is a waste of time is social anxiety. It's people who are stereotypically more introverted usually don't feel comfortable speaking up in an unstructured group setting. Reason number 3, regression to the mean. This is the idea that if you group brainstorm and you end up with, let's say, 20 ideas, the quality of those ideas will likely form a bell curve. So you'll have some ideas that, let's be honest, they're pretty terrible and they're really not worth considering. You'll also have a few ideas that are absolutely fabulous on the other end of that bell curve. And then you'll have the middle of the bell curve, which has the majority of the ideas that are suggested in your group setting. The trouble is, because the majority are in the middle, you're probably going to spend the majority of your time talking about all of those ideas, instead of the few on the right-hand side of the bell curve that you really should be focused on. That's regression to the mean. And the last reason why group brainstorming is a waste of time is called production blocking. Only one of us can talk at a time. If you have too many people talking, then no one is actually heard. And if you have 15 people in a room and only one person is talking, you quite literally have an issue of people just sitting around waiting for their turn to contribute to the conversation. So if these are reasons why people are not contributing in an equal way to your retrospectives, how can we overcome those issues? One way that we could do that is to promote a mechanism by which people can, in quotes, speak, even if it's not verbal. So for example, we use Post-it notes, or if you're a distributed team, you could use an online tool that allows you to write in ideas onto virtual sticky notes. The key here is not the sticky notes. The key here is that if you're allowing people to contribute their ideas during the sprint as they occur, as opposed to during the retrospective, you have 2 advantages. One is that you're going to increase anonymity because people are writing their things down as they occur at any point in time as opposed to during the retro. And the second big advantage of that approach is that you're going to overcome some of those issues that make group brainstorming a waste of time. Things like production blocking. Now everyone can contribute to the conversation at any point in time. Things like social anxiety. For people who are more introverted, you'll be able to actually contribute your ideas at any point in time in a way that's not verbal. All of these things will help to create a safe environment. Anonymity and asynchronous communication increases the odds that you'll have equal participation in your retrospective. Now let's imagine for a moment that your retrospectives are now ones in which people feel comfortable speaking up. What do we do next? Now the retrospective is over, we've come up with an action item. How can we actually go ahead and try to encourage follow-through? Remember, this is the #1 reason that people struggle with their retrospectives per the annual retrospectives report that we sent out and showed earlier in this webinar. So one way to encourage follow-through is to do something physical. Now the first time I heard this advice, I was a bit taken aback. What do you mean do something physical? So let me give you a concrete example. Imagine your action item is something like, we want to increase the frequency by which we are communicating with our product owner in order to get feedback more early in the process and more often as well. If you were just writing down that action item, maybe into a backlog somewhere, or perhaps just keeping it stored mentally for the sprint, it would be difficult to know if you actually achieved your outcome. How would you know if you actually are communicating with that PO more frequently? So if you do something physical as a manifestation of that action item, you're actually more likely to follow through with accomplishing that goal. One way to have a physical manifestation of that particular example is the following. Put a poster board somewhere up around your team room. And every time anyone on your team communicates with the product owner, anytime there's a conversation happening there, go ahead, take a marker, and just put a strike on that poster board, indicating, yep, I talked to that individual. Yep, I talked to that individual. Over the course of the sprint, you're going to end up with a number of those strikes up on the poster board. And you'll find it's kind of like a game. The more times people are adding a strike to that poster board, the more likely it is that others will want to do the same thing. Somehow, the physical manifestation of that action item is incredibly powerful. And it reinforces the fact that this is something we all should be working on achieving. You may question this by saying, well, that's great, but are there always physical manifestations of action items? And the answer is actually, in almost every case, yes. You'd be surprised, if you're creative, how many times you can come up with a way of physically manifesting the action you're trying to take. So I encourage you to think creatively here. Make it into a game, make it highly visible, and make it something your team wants to do. If you do that, it will be much more effective at encouraging follow-through than simply talking about it in your retrospective or writing it down on a backlog. Okay, great. So now we have a fully engaged team in the retrospective, and we're also encouraging follow-through in our retrospective. All of that is fantastic from a team's perspective, and perhaps that's increasing your voice within the context of your team. But remember, what we're after here is not just items that your team can solve. We're trying to figure out how you can get a voice throughout the organization. In essence, how can we solve those bigger organizational issues that are not easily solved in most of your retrospectives? So the next tip that I give you is something called the Retrospective Radiator. So at the end of your retrospective, most of us have heard the advice of what happens in the retro stays in the retro. Right? What we're talking about in the retrospective stays in the retrospective. That might be true from the perspective of the inputs to the retrospective. In other words, the conversations that occur during the retrospective. Certainly those should be private to increase safety. But the artifacts coming out of the retrospective, the things we've learned, the things that we are acting upon, the impediments that we're facing that we can't solve, the things that we've really succeeded at that we want to share with the rest of the organization, the hypotheses that we have and the experiments that we're running to try to improve, all of those things you should intentionally make as public as you possibly can. This is coming from the concept of the town crier. The idea that if you have an issue, and it's an organizational level issue, don't keep that within the context of your team. Yell at the top of your lungs to the rest of the organization, help, we need help with this. Someone please help us. Because if you do that, you in essence are creating a voice for yourself. You're saying, hey, this is something we need your assistance to solve, and it is a showstopper. It is a blocker for us. Now, the retrospective radiator is one way to achieve that. If you hang this poster board in a highly visible place inside your organization that's outside of your team room, people as they walk by the hallway where this is hanging will be able to see your retrospective radiator. And as you walk throughout the halls of your organization, you'll see other teams' retrospective radiators, and you'll be able to learn from them. In fact, one recommendation that I have with this particular tip is put up little dot vote stickies underneath your radiator. You know what I'm talking about, the circular small votes that you can place. And if you see something on someone else's radiator that really resonates with you, a big impediment that your team is facing perhaps, or a learning that another team had that you guys also had inside your team, put that little dot vote up there. Indicate, yeah, that's something that resonates with me. That will help you because if on your retrospective radiator you're seeing a lot of agreement on an impediment that you're facing, now you have the assurance that it's not just my team that's suffering from this problem. This is actually a problem that teams across the organization are facing. It will give you more confidence to go up the chain and try to get help from people who can actually help solve these issues. The retrospective radiator is a mindset shift that your team will have to go through. It's not an overnight thing because most of us are trained to keep the issues we are talking about hidden and internal. Instead, we want to broadcast them. It's a complete 180 from what you might currently be doing. All right, we now have a fully engaged team with our retrospectives. We're working on follow-through by doing things that are physical, and then we're broadcasting through the retrospective radiator what we've learned, what our impediments are to the rest of the organization. What's next? The next recommendation that I have is to create something called the Circle of Retrospective Facilitators. So many of us might have heard the suggestion that within the context of our team, it's the Scrum Master who should always be doing the facilitating. It's that person's job. Or alternatively, some of us might have heard alternative advice, which is that actually we should rotate the role of the facilitator within the context of our team. That's all great. And if either one of those models are working for you within your team, then by all means, continue doing them. If they're working, why change? But if you're struggling with your retrospectives, then there is an alternative that I'd suggest, which is the Circle of Retrospective Facilitators. The idea here is that, let's say I'm a facilitator on Team A. I should go ahead and volunteer to facilitate Team B's retrospectives. And then the next week, I might volunteer to facilitate Team C's retrospectives. And similarly, the facilitator from Team B might facilitate my retrospectives in Team A, and so on and so forth. There's a number of advantages here, some of which are obvious, some of which are a bit hidden. Number one, there's a big problem when you're a facilitator of your own team's retrospectives, which is that you have a stake in the game. You're a member of the team. I was recently at a retreat that was focusing on retrospectives, and I was talking to one of the world's best retrospective facilitators, bar none. And that individual was saying that even she struggles to facilitate her own team's retrospectives because of the amount of items, the amount of things she wants to contribute to the conversation. The effective facilitation requires some amount of impartiality, and that's very hard if it's your own team. Another advantage of this type of setup is that you will have exposure to other facilitators' techniques. So if you're talking about how your team's a bit bored with the way that you're facilitating retrospectives, bring someone else in. Ask them, how would you facilitate a retrospective, and then watch and learn. You're going to learn new ways of facilitating which you can use to level up your facilitation skills. Perhaps the biggest reason why this is an effective way of getting the word out and keeping engagement high with retrospectives is that the more teams that you help with their retrospectives, the more dots you'll be able to connect between teams. In other words, if you see a problem that Team A is facing, and then you also see a problem that B, C, and D are facing, and it's the same problem, that's really useful information that you wouldn't have were you just facilitating Team A's retrospectives. The ability to connect the dots and see themes across teams will make you a more effective organizational voice. Because now you can go up to management and say, I know for a fact that 50% of the teams in this organization struggle with this problem. Think about how effective you can be as a contributor to your organization's performance if those are the types of insights that you can provide, as opposed to what you're doing today, which most likely is just within the context of your own team. Lastly, and this is probably not as important as the previous point, but from a personal perspective, it's still something to pay attention to. If you are facilitating multiple teams retrospectives throughout the organization, you'll end up with a personal brand inside your company that you don't have today. I know that in my last job that I had before I founded Retrium, people knew me within the 50 or so people who I worked with. But outside of those 50 people, I wasn't so well known. By facilitating other teams' retrospectives, you'll have a personal brand that you wouldn't have otherwise. And that can help you in your organizational journey and in terms of understanding more about what the organization is struggling with, and also making sure that people are aware of the skills and the talents that you as an individual have. Okay, so now we have engagement, we have follow-through. We're broadcasting through our radiators out to the organization, the learnings, the impediments that we are facing at a team level, and then we're going ahead and now facilitating other teams' retrospectives. If you think about all of that and what it can culminate as, ultimately it culminates with this particular slide, which is that once you have the ability to detect themes and common problems and common impediments and common learnings across the organization, wouldn't it be nice to have a systematic way to aggregate all that data, all of the information, all of the learnings you're getting from teams, and on a every other week basis, present them to management? In other words, if you have these radiators set up throughout your organization, maybe at an Agile coaching level or an Agile leadership team level, you can bring all of that information to a meeting that's run every other week, or maybe it's once a month, where you're trying to find the dots, to connect the dots between all of those different ideas that you have, and distill them down to maybe 3, maybe 4 different themes, different thematic issues that your teams are facing. Those insights are likely going to correspond in a very one-to-one way with the organizational problems that your teams are facing that they can't solve at the team level. Going way back to the beginning of the talk where I mentioned how almost 50% of teams, their number one issue with successful retrospective is that the issues they talk about can't be solved by the team. Wouldn't it be comforting to know that there is a process in place by which those issues are going to be systematically digested by management so they can be acted upon? That ultimately is the most effective way of increasing your team's and your individual voice in the organization. In fact, if you're not doing this, then it's almost impossible, unless you have by chance, a wonderful interpersonal relationship with the CTO of your company, it's almost impossible to get your voice be heard. This is a type of mature team practice that you see from teams that are really good and organizations that are really good at retrospecting. But don't start here. This is the culmination, not the starting point. You want to start with increasing engagement. You want to start with following through on action items that your team can control, and then radiating out all of the things that you're learning from a team level. All of those things are controllable by your team, so it's important to start there. But once you have that down pat, once those things are going well, start the circle of retrospective facilitators and start a program of, on a regular and frequent basis, aggregating the themes across your retrospective and bubbling those up to management. If you do that, you'll end up with employee voice that you never had before. Thank you very much, everybody. For Nikki and myself, I really enjoyed being here. I hope you learned something about the hidden drivers of engagement in your organizations, as well as some practical tips you can take to increase your voice and increase the quality of your retrospectives.
All right, excellent. David and Nikki, thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and take some questions that we received from the audience. Again, if you do have a question for the presenters, please enter them into the chat window on the left-hand side. I'm going to go ahead and pick some out. If we do not get to your questions, we will follow up with these questions in a Q&A document within the following weeks. So we did receive a question earlier from the webinar. Retrospectives have become somewhat of a blaming game. How do you deal with that?
Nikki, do you want to go, or do you want me to take this one?
Sure, you start it off, and I'll add some color commentary if needed.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, first of all, if retrospectives are a blame game, I always take a step back, and I ask myself, well, why? This is actually a retrospective facilitation technique, 5 whys, where you continually ask why until you get to the root of the issue. Usually when retrospectives are a blame game, it's unlikely that the problem is the retrospective itself. The problem is usually something a bit deeper than that maybe there's lack of trust on your team. Or maybe, just as an example, if you happen to work in a distributed environment, and maybe you've never had the opportunity to meet in person and go out for a coffee or have lunch together. You don't really know everyone else on your team. There's usually deeper causes to something like a blame game in retrospectives. So I would work to identify what that issue is and then try to solve the root issue as opposed to solving it in the retrospective itself. If you have a lot of trust in your team and people are still blaming each other in the retrospective, it's entirely possible that the facilitation techniques that you're using are not the appropriate ones for your retrospective. So for example, a lot of teams skip over the whole appreciations concept in a retrospective. So they skip right to, what can we do better? What should we start doing? What should we stop doing? These are very heavy concepts to jump right to. And instead, if we take a moment to just appreciate each other by going around the room and asking, what did we all do well over the past 2 weeks and how can we compliment each other? Sometimes that can reset the tone of the retrospective to be a bit more positive as opposed to jumping right to blame. But again, I wouldn't start there. I'd start by asking the 5 whys and dig to the root of the issue. Usually that's most effective.
Excellent. We've been receiving a lot of questions about distributed teams and retrospectives. Could you also elaborate on the retrospective radiator and how it may apply to distributed teams?
Yeah, I mean, distributed teams are a webinar topic in and of itself, so perhaps we can come back to that sometime. Distributed retrospectives are complex. So the radiator itself is an artifact that you really want to be as visible as you possibly can. And so if you are on a distributed team, likely you can't actually physically hang it outside your team room, or you could, but it wouldn't be as effective as if it was online somewhere. Hopefully you have some sort of a wiki page or some sort of a Slack group that you could call, maybe to create a channel in there called Radiators, where every time you update it, you could post a new image of that radiator. Maybe you have a Trello board for this purpose. There's a lot of different ways of broadcasting out the retrospective radiator. The key point here is to make it in a place that people frequent and are curious about, as opposed to something that's hidden. But I back up also from the radiator concept when we're talking about distributed teams, because engagement obviously is much more difficult when it comes to distributed teams in all aspects of work, not just retrospectives. But when it comes to retrospectives in particular, the number one tip that I would give all of you for distributed retrospectives is whatever you do, do not just have an audio conference, do not just have a video chat. Just like if you're in person and you're sitting around a table, you wouldn't just talk for your retrospective. You'd use a facilitation technique that involves sticky notes and flip charts and markers, grouping items together, dot voting, prioritized discussion. There's a flow to a good retrospective. You want to make sure you're doing the same thing with your distributed teams. In fact, one of the most common issues I see with distributed teams is that you have maybe half of people in one room around one conference table and then maybe half of people somewhere else. And you have the first half using Post-it notes and the second half having to just kind of call in and ask people to write things down on those Post-its. That generally doesn't work because the people who are calling in who don't have access to your facilitation tools will feel like second-class citizens. So instead, what you want to do is find a way to facilitate those retrospectives in a way that levels the playing field. I'm not here to, of course, advertise Retrium, but that's one way of doing it. You could also use Trello. You could use Google Docs. Just go ahead and explore the tools that are out there and find one that works for your team to ensure that there's a way to facilitate the same techniques that you might use if you were in person.
All right, excellent. We received a question. Is it a good idea to keep track of action items from retrospection? If yes, how? How do you do that?
Nikki, you want me to keep answering, or you want to take one?
Sure. Yeah, I know
Okay.
It's important to keep track of action items from retrospectives. Certainly, if you're talking about things and there are things that come out of the retrospective that you actually need to do, then keeping track of them is really important. And teams come up with lots of different ways to do that. Certainly, you could put it into whatever tool that you're using to manage your workflow. That's one way to do it. You could keep it in a separate list or a separate board if that makes sense. It's sort of a preference of the team and where they would like that information to be visible to everyone. But absolutely, if there are things that come out of the retrospective, after all, if you keep on having retrospectives and there's things that need to get done, and then you get back every retrospective and you say, we didn't do anything, we didn't do anything, we didn't do anything, that's going to be a problem. And you need to have an owner for those items. And if it's really important enough to spend 30 minutes or an hour discussing and getting to some action items, then it's important enough to put it through and make sure that it gets done. And if the action item isn't for the team, it's an important thing to, again, go up and out in the organization to the right party, either through a scrum of scrums or some other mechanism where feedback gets given to people at higher levels in the organization who can then dig down and make sure that those things are addressed.
And I have one more thing to that also, which is that the most powerful way I've ever discovered of tracking and then helping to ensure follow-through on any action, not just something coming out of a retrospective, is to commit to it publicly early in the process. In other words, if out of a retrospective you come up with an action item where I go back to my example of communicating more often with the product owner, go ahead and tell the product owner, this is what we've decided to do right after the retrospective is over, and say, within the next 2 weeks, we're going to try to talk to you 3 times a day at a minimum. By telling him that's what you're going to do, you are in effect creating accountability for yourself before you know if you can even do it. So an example of this in my life was this webinar. When we first started talking about holding this webinar, we didn't have this slide deck, and yet we committed to a date. We said publicly, this is going to happen. And because it was there, because it was public, we had accountability. We had to actually go ahead and follow through. So try to take that back to your teams as well. Make things as public as you can. Commit to them so that you're going to be forced to actually follow through as much as you possibly can.
All right. So, great. We have time for a couple more questions. We received a question from Rahul. How frequently should we change the retrospective techniques?
Yeah, there's really no end-all be-all answer here. One of the nice things about Agile coaching is that the answer to most questions is it depends. So if your team is effective at using the same technique every single time and you're actually changing and improving as a result of it, then don't modify that. Alternatively, if you find lack of engagement and one technique's not working for you, then go ahead and try as many of them as you possibly can. There's no one answer for the entire industry. What I would say is that usually people focus too much on the technique they're using. So certainly facilitation techniques are important. Certainly we should all learn about many different ways of facilitating retrospectives. Certainly there are different techniques that are more appropriate for different situations. I'm not trying to argue that that's not true. But again, if you're not following through on the retrospective, then it doesn't matter what technique you're using. So if you're struggling with your retrospective, I would just downplay just a bit the technique you're using and instead focus on the follow-through. That has a big advantage because if you actually change as a result of an action item coming out of a retrospective, if your team sees that things are improving, then they'll be more engaged the next time you run the retrospective. This is the virtuous cycle that we were talking about. Whereas if you just change techniques, but you don't focus on the follow-through aspect of it, then it really doesn't matter. People will continuously be disengaged forever, unfortunately.
Excellent. We got time for one more question, and this kind of ties into what you previously mentioned. How do you prevent boredom at retrospectives?
Nikki, you want to take it?
Yeah, sure. So I think there are lots of ways that you do it. Certainly the technique is one of them. Rotating the facilitator is obviously going to be a second one, either within your team or the circle of retrospective facilitators, because that's going to just help mix it up. Putting things at the beginning of your retrospective that either a topic to talk about specifically, or some data from your last sprint or appreciations is going to help mix it up a little bit more. And, getting into that early part of the retrospecting, kind of setting a different tone for it, can also kind of break people out of what they're typically doing. So it might be, addressing, starting off the retrospective in a different way to kind of break the ice and get everybody out of the same mindset that they typically are using. That's certainly one way to do it. And again, the facilitation rotation is going to help bring new voices into the room and perhaps bring some new insights to the table.
And change the context, right? You don't always have to do it around the same conference room or the same office building that you're always in. Go outside, go for lunch. Just changing your environment can sometimes breed innovation and engagement in a way that sitting around the same room again and again would not.
All right, excellent. Well, David and Nikki, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. We've received a lot of good feedback within the Q&A panel. Lots of good questions, lots of good comments. So those are all the questions we have time for. Again, thank you everyone for coming to today's webinar and participating in this presentation. Again, this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted to the Scrum Alliance website and sent via email to all who registered. If you have any questions about our webinars or questions for Scrum Alliance, please contact us at support@scrumalliance.org. And again, thank you so much to David and Nikki for an excellent presentation.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.